Next mindset is productive paranoia. This is another big one, but it's a bit more complicated. So we're going to dig a bit deeper into this. It's one of my favorite quotes for one of my favorite thinkers. So Jim Collins. And it's a long quote, but I wanted you to kind of have it because it's absolutely crucial. It says, the best leaders were not more risk-taking, more bold, more visionary, and more creative than the comparison. So note the typical things that often are associated with kind of great leaders: risk-taking, bold, visionary, creative. They were more disciplined, more empirical, and more paranoid. And again, look at the difference between what is key to leadership versus what actually is not, but typically associated with leadership. And what we're going to focus here on is the word paranoid. And as Jim evolves the concept, he describes it as actually productive paranoia. Now, productive paranoia has two elements to it: the paranoid part and the productive part. Let's talk about the paranoid part first. The paranoia we're talking about here is the willingness to believe there's a chance that you're wrong after you have done everything, and I mean everything, all the research, tests, interviews, to prove that you're right. And when I say an openness to being wrong, I don't mean, oh, it's theoretically possible that you're wrong. I mean a legitimate openness to being wrong, being alive to the very real possibility that you can be wrong. And what's interesting about this is they don't always use the phrase paranoia, but history is replete with people confirming the wisdom of paranoia. So for example, I have this quote from Daniel Boorstin, who lived in the 1900s. The greatest obstacle to knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. Then there's a quote from Epictetus around 55 to 135 AD. It is impossible to begin to learn that which one thinks one already knows. And I could actually probably have a famous quote for each 100 years from Epictetus to Daniel Boorstin. It's just this common knowledge and this theme that if you believe you are right, you are closing the chances of you learning. And what's intriguing about this is we are not always the best judge of whether we are right or wrong. So there's this great quote from John Carter. It says, almost always complacent individuals do not view themselves as complacent. They see themselves as behaving quite rationally given the circumstances. So you can't rely on whether you think you're right or wrong. Just embrace this idea that you can be wrong. Because again, if you don't, you're limiting all the chance of learning that you can get by going on your journey. And even if you are very, very smart, they found that surprisingly being smart can actually make bias worse. So the moral of the story and this wisdom is embrace the idea, always, that there's a very real possibility that you can be wrong. No matter how much information is telling you, you can be right. Now, there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'm going to actually walk you through it. This is actually from the book that we start off with, The Innovator's DNA. And as you recall, they kind of figured out, I don't quite agree with the way they phrased it, but the mindsets I'm proposing to you essentially capture what they think the key ingredients are to innovation. But again, own your journey. Feel free to check out The Innovator's DNA if the mindsets we're talking about and the techniques aren't working for you. So they determined at the bottom of the chart the key ingredients to being truly innovative or being innovative were associating, questioning, observing, experimenting, and networking. And through data, they figured out there's four absolute titans of innovation. So Michael Lazaridis, Pierre Omidyar, Scott Cook, Michael Dell. And they compared them to people who are literally in this chart called non-innovators. What I find is most people kind of gravitate to the purple and the greens of like who's scoring high. But the thing that should terrify you about this chart is not those scores, but the orange one, like the non-innovators. Because notice how the non-innovators, who are obviously literally described as non-innovators, right? do not score 0 on associating, questioning, and the other categories. They score between 40 and 50. Why is this significant for you? What that means is when you hear about a technique such as associating or questioning, and you tend to go, oh, I do that, resist the comfort that that brings, because you could score between 40 to 50 on doing that and literally be considered a non-innovator. So anytime you're introduced to a technique for innovation and you think, oh yeah, I do that, fight that comfort level, embrace the paranoia. Another interesting story about this chart is even if you do score exceptionally high, like Mike Lazaridis did, he was connected to RIM BlackBerry. And although they were doing great for a while, they've had some huge challenges. So just because, again, you can score highly on innovation today, doesn't mean you can score highly on innovation tomorrow, because circumstances are constantly changing, especially if you're a change maker and pursuing innovation. So again, be paranoid. I know you just kind of started off on your journey through Catalyze, but if I had actually asked you, what's the biggest issue you face? You're going to think of things, but I would argue the biggest issue you face right now is, what if you were wrong? If I asked you, what's the second biggest issue? I would argue the second biggest issue you're facing is, what if you're right today, but things change to make you wrong tomorrow? So be paranoid. One final story I want to tell you to kind of induce you to embrace this attitude of paranoia is Dan O'Reilly, and I'm butchering his name, and I apologize, Dan, wherever you are. Dan's a really interesting guy. He operates out of Duke. He studies how we make decisions, and one of his most famous books is called Predictably Irrational. It was a New York Times bestseller, and he's constantly finding that our thought process tends towards the irrational, i.e. it doesn't really make sense. It's not optimal for serving us. And one of the things he did to experiment how we think is something called the dice game. I'm going to talk to you about the dice game for a second. So the dice game is played like this. I'm going to give you a dice, and you're going to roll it. But before you roll it, pick in your head whether you want the top number it lands on or the bottom number. Don't tell anybody. After you roll, tell us which you had picked before you had rolled, and then you're going to get a dollar value based on the roll of the dice that you pick. So for example, if before you rolled you pick the top dice and the number 6 is at the top, you would get $6. If you pick the bottom and number 1 is on the bottom, you get $1. Okay? And you would do this 10 times, and he would do it with lots and lots of people. And what he's trying to do is take over so that odds rule, so that the more and more you do, odds rule, so that 50% of the time people should be picking the low dice, 50% of the time people should be picking the high dice, because again, that's 50-50 of the odds. But what he found is, particularly when it came to a choice between 6 and 1 or 5 and 2, people were picking the higher number way more than the odds said they should. So, well, this is strange. So he had them do lie detectors. And sure enough, it turned out people were lying. They were picking a different number from what they initially picked because of the roll of the dice. So he decided to change up the game. He said, rather than you keeping the money, money's going to go to your favorite charity. So exactly the same thing happened in terms of there were way higher odds of people picking higher numbers better. So again, he did a lie detector. This time the lie detector wasn't triggered. So it's, what's going on here? Are people just luckier when they're dealing with charitable causes? Of course, that's not going to be the case. So what he figured out was, because now there is an incentive to lie because you're not benefiting, a social good is benefiting, we can actually trick ourselves into believing what we want to believe to make the world a better place. I'm often asked, what's the difference between entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship? I find that they're best. They're very, very similar. What the key difference is this. Although we are predictably irrational at the best of times, when it comes to making the world a better place, we want it so badly, there's a higher tendency that we can lie to ourselves. So if you're doing through Catalyze a project where it actually makes the world a better place, you need to be extra vigilant. You need to embrace paranoia. So hopefully you're now all kind of feeling more paranoid than you were at the beginning of this webinar. That's good, but you're only halfway there, because remember, it not only has to be paranoid, It has to be productive paranoia. The productive paranoia has two elements. And again, this will be in the workbook that we're giving you. Number one of being productive, although you have to do analysis, you can engage in analysis paralysis, i.e. you can't kind of be hesitant forever. Eventually you have to kind of do stuff even though there's a possibility you're still wrong or could be wrong. The second thing is, I don't want you to think of this as this dispiriting, oh boy, I can never think I'm right. This kind of sucks. I'm always having a huge chance of being proved wrong. How defeating is this? I never have the security of being right. I want you to actually turn that around. It's not this self-defeating, you can never be sure you're right. What it actually means is there's always an opportunity to get better. There's always an opportunity to investigate and learn, if you're open to it, to better achieve your why. It is like the most incredible gift that you can have if you fully embrace it as this exciting journey of ongoing discovery and enhanced impact. And if this sounds kind of philosophical to you and kind of too naive, I want you to consider this diagram. So think about your happiness. Think about it in like 3 states where you know something for sure, and you know you're right. You think you're right, but you're not sure. Or you don't know, or you're actually wrong. And I appreciate don't knowing and being wrong are 2 different things, but I'm going to lump them in for the point of this exercise. I bet if I asked you to chart your happiness on those 3 states, most of you would go, I'm happiest when I know things for sure and I know I'm right. I'm middle happy when I think I'm right but not sure. I'm least happy when I don't know or I'm wrong. But now let's actually track personal growth and your opportunities for personal growth. I would actually argue that when it comes to personal growth, you have less chance of having personal growth when you know things for sure. You have a middle amount of personal growth when you think you're right but not sure. And you have the most room for personal growth in situations where you don't know what's true or you're wrong about thinking, having an opinion on what you think is actually true or what you think the case can be. And notice how like we're conflicted. Our happiness is going in one direction, personal growth is in another direction. So we're kind of torn apart. If you could actually look at seeing happiness is focusing on personal growth, you can actually be in harmony. You can embrace this idea that personal growth is maximized where you don't know or you're wrong. And again, if you're skeptical about this, every quote I showed you indicates that the best opportunities for increased knowledge and personal growth is when you're open to being wrong. So stop being at kind of cross purposes. Finally see that your true path to happiness is exploring things you don't know and where you're kind of wrong.